Welcome to the Digital Authoritarianism podcast series. Each episode uncovers how digital technologies are reshaping authoritarian politics, revealing global and regional patterns of digital repression and the creative ways civil societies fight back, speaking to researchers, journalists, and activists. The hosts of this podcast are Janjira, Sangeeta, and Andreas, research fellows at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, Hamburg. We are glad to share this important conversation with you. Let's dive in.
Yeah, welcome everybody to the fifth podcast in our series on digital authoritarianism through lawfare. This is a research project conducted at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies in Hamburg, GIGA. It is on different forms of digital authoritarianism in South and Southeast Asia, about the role of laws and regulations, and opportunities for civil society pushback. It builds on a previous project on anti-fake news lawfare in India, Bangladesh, Thailand, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. The project team at GIGA encompasses my colleagues Sangeeta Mahapatra, Janjira Sombatpoonsiri, and me. My name is Andreas Ufen. I'm a senior research fellow at GIGA, and I have a special interest in politics in Indonesia and Malaysia. Within our project, we focus on Indonesia, a majoritarian Muslim country that is currently by VDEM classified as being in the gray zone between electoral autocracy and electoral democracy. Today, I'm very happy to talk to Dr. Rafiqa Qurrata A'yun. Hi, Rafiqa.
Hello, Andreas. Thank
Rafiqa
you for inviting me.
Rafiqa is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Law, University of Indonesia, and a senior researcher at the Center for Interdisciplinary Research of Law and Economics at the Faculty of Law, University of Indonesia. She's also an honorary fellow at Melbourne Law School, an associate at the Center for Indonesian Law, Islam and Society at the University of Melbourne. And she's also the 2025-26 Mellon Scholars at Risk Academic Freedom Fellow. Her research interests include law and religion, law and politics, Indonesia's legal reform, democratization and Islamist politics, and academic freedom. She's also the author of a book recently published by Routledge on law and politics of blasphemy in Indonesia. And she has written a lot and published in various academic journals such as Indonesia, the Australian Journal of Asian Law, Third World Quarterly, Melbourne Asia Review, Prisma, and the Indonesia Law Review. Additionally, her commentaries and op-eds have appeared in several media outlets, including The Conversation Inside Indonesia and the Jakarta Post. So, Rafiqa, I would start with a few questions on your book on blasphemy. Could you tell us why you were interested in that subject? Why is it so relevant to work on blasphemy in Indonesia?
Yeah, thank you, Andreas. Thank you for inviting me here. And it is also great to know about your project and the website, the tracker. And it's really an amazing project. So yeah, well, about my book, this is my first academic book. So it is basically the result of my 4.5 years of PhD study at the University of Melbourne. So the background of this research is blasphemy cases, those like involving criminal charges related to blasphemy provisions in Indonesia. But this book is not only about the law, as in texts and institutions, because when we talk about blasphemy offenses in Indonesia, we talk about a wider dimension that goes beyond just criminal law. We talk about religion, we talk about religious authority, we talk about politics, democracy, and free speech too. So, as the third largest democracy and with Islam as the majority, accounting for over 80% of the society, so it seems like the, the society seems to be highly influenced by Islam. And in fact, some studies have also found that Indonesian Muslims are increasingly showing signs of piousness publicly compared to, let's say, 20 to 30 years ago. But Indonesia is not an Islamic state. So here, Indonesia offers an interesting insight into how religion influenced politics and vice versa. And yeah, I think this sparked questions like, is religion merely an instrument for powerful social force, or is there any connection between blasphemy narratives and power contest? And what is the situation of the rule of law that makes religion uh, religious related laws like blasphemy provisions persist for quite a long time with a relatively high number of cases? So these are some of my questions. So basically, I explored blasphemy issues as a starting point to understand how the law operates in the Indonesian context. And as I also argued in this book, and there is a distinct legal order that is shaped by a certain form of capitalism that reflects existing power dynamics, and laws connected to religion, like the blasphemy laws, help me gain further insight into this. So maybe
Yeah,
that's how I can introduce my book.
yeah, that's very interesting. I think we can go into detail in the next few minutes. I would like to start, to talk about the empirical part of your blasphemy book. I mean, how exactly do you define blasphemy? And referring to that, I was struck that for the first, let's say, 20 years of Indonesia's history after independence, there was no real blasphemy law, and it did not really play a role, although Indonesia was a majoritarian Muslim country, and there were Islamist parties that played a major role in the 1950s. But how do you explain that? Why was blasphemy not a real issue at least from 1945 until 1965? Then in 1965, President Sukarno came out with, I think, a presidential regulation or something like that. And we usually think that Sukarno is more, well, a president who would support religious tolerance. Why Sukarno, and why in 1965, and why not before?
Yeah, well, this is always an interesting questions about like the history of blasphemy in Indonesia. And in my book, it's like I found that the history of blasphemy is pretty long history, but I limited the timeline like for my research to the late colonial era as the starting point. And yeah, back to Indonesia, like when we get back to the late colonial era when Indonesia was still the Dutch East Indies, back then religious issues, like specifically the Islamic ones, were also political and economic concerns for the colonial authorities. For example, by regulating Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca or the Hajj. And the purpose was not only to control trade and transportation, but also to monitor the spread of pan-Islamic ideas, like Arab solidarity and anti-colonial ideas from the Muslim groups. So this is not too much to say that Islam has been a caution for the authority, either in positive or negative way. And when we talk about blasphemy, we talk about this religious authority and we talk about religious mobilization. And this mobilization is the main factor that, in the majority of cases I research, has made it possible for uh, how the law is enacted, and then how the accusation then became a prosecution and then conviction. So when we discuss about what happened actually in the Suharto era, well, yeah, as you already mentioned, like the cases back then in Suharto era was not as high compared to the post-authoritarian, but it was only in the before 1990s, because like after the 1990s, like it's like totally contrasted. Before 1990, the blasphemy cases were very rare, and that was the years when Suharto, the dictator, he didn't need Islamic support. So he instead repressed Islamist groups. But after the 1990s, when there was tension within the military, Suharto found new allies, especially from the conservative Muslims. And that was when the blasphemy cases were rising. So it's after the 1990s. So there was a connection here on how politics has defined religious groups in the public sphere and how they responded to blasphemy accusation. And consequently, it impacted to the number of cases that reached the court. It also actually explained about why Sukarno uh, decided to issue this law, even though maybe in some of uh, his writing, he mentioned like his Islamic identity or how he became like accommodating nationalists and other type of beliefs, for example. Because like I traced some newspaper documents for this research, and then I also learn about how was the relationship of Sukarno back then with the army and the communists were in tension, and he was then get close with the Islamic groups, specifically the Nahdlatul Ulama, and it was the Minister of Religious Affairs, Saifuddin Zuhri, who was who were considered as the initiator of blasphemy law that later become this Article 156A of the old criminal code. Yeah.
Okay, and then after 65 came Suharto with the new order, the Orde Baru, and it was a closed authoritarian system for over 30 years. But if I understand you correctly, there were, I think, more than 100 cases when the blasphemy law was used against people who, well, expressed themselves in a way that would have been seen as blasphemous. But you said it really began in the late 1980s or early 1990s. From 65 to 1990, there were not so many cases, but it really began in the late period of the new order in Indonesia. Is that correct?
Yes, it's only one case in the 1967, if I'm not 69. So it's the case of this publication from the Pope of Indonesian Literature, H.B. Jasin. So yeah, so that's like the publication in this literature magazine, and it was only brought to the court in 1970s, and after that there was no prosecution until 1990, the Ars Wendo case. Yeah.
And then in 1998, 99, Indonesia was democratized, one would say, the first free and fair elections in 1999, the first free and fair elections after 1955, actually, after more than 4 decades. And since then, Indonesia is perceived as electoral democratic, more or less. And well, you said in your book that after 98, 99, the number of cases has been rising, or is there more intensive struggle about freedom of expression, especially with reference to religious issues? Is that true?
Yeah, actually, there were more other research that mentioned about this rising number of blasphemy cases in the post-authoritarian, and it mainly addressed the free speech, like you mentioned, like because of people can freely like express their religious expressions in public sphere, and there are also concern from the presidency of the Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, the SBY. Like back then, Islam was largely accommodated by the SBY during his presidency from 2004 to 2014. And there were also numerous local regulation with an Islamic or Sharia basis. But as as some research also shows, this regulation were initiated by politicians from secular nationalist parties, not the Islamic ones. So even in this context, it was not like the Islamization or the fragmentation of political Islam that make like Muslim groups seems like in the public sphere more than before. So we see that Islamic groups need to ally with any politicians who can channel their interests in formalizing Islam or Islamizing the state. And for political elites in the electoral contest, this is a good source of political support. And they do it by mobilizing Islamic narratives, like showing piousness that they are devoted Muslims to get voter support.
But how would you then assess Islamization in general? I mean, in the literature, most people would say that since the late 1960s, early 1970s, Islamization has been going on at all levels, political Islamization, at the social level. But most people would say that after 1998, Islamists have been much stronger than before. And groups like FPE, for example, would you say there's a profound Islamization in Indonesia, and that this has been accelerated since the early 2000s, or is it a misconception?
Well, yeah, I would say that if it's anything, Islamization in the post 1998, and we see more like in SBY era, and that's because like Islam was largely accommodated by SBY, and I think it's more like a symptom of the fragmentation of political Islam, that Muslim groups are fragmented and lack of strong political representations. So as I said before, like they need to ally with any politicians to channel their interests. And actually, it also happened in Suharto era, like in the 1990s, by how he uh, tried to express more his Islamic identity in public, like adding Muhammad as his first name, going on the pilgrimage to Mecca, and then is established an Islamic think tank, IJMI, and then Sharia Bank, Muamalat, and so on and so forth. So is this kind of trend like a sign that Islamic group is winning in formal politics? And I think it's not necessarily, because they remain fragmented and only serve as like junior partner in such a loose alliance, which can be left behind at any time, as what Prabowo did in 2019. And we should also remember that under Joko Widodo presidency in 2014 to 2024, Islam was marginalized politically, and he made Islamic political expression quite pronounced as a movement and source of opposition. And it was then responded by the state with more repressive measures, such as amending the societal organization law, the Ormas law, and this was used to justify the disbandment of organizations considered against state ideology, like the Hizbut Tahrir Indonesia, and then the Islamic Defenders Front, the FBI, and also the police also did this unlawful killing of FBI members. And now that Islamic political expressions looks like less pronounced, that's not because Islamists are weaker, because they have never been strong either. So as I mentioned, like they are fragmented, they look strong when the state needs to accommodate them by mobilizing Islamic narrative, just like SBY and Suharto did in the 1990s. But they also look strong when the state represses them. So it's like leveraging Islam as an important source of opposition during Joko Widodo era. And Prabowo, I think he takes the middle path, making Islamic groups seem less significant and then less pronounced politically, either as a source of state legitimacy or as a source of opposition. And this was done by giving them like a number of political and business concessions, like ministerial positions, and then commissioners' roles in state-owned enterprises, and also mining concessions recently. Yeah.
So, but are there different types of Islamization going on at the same time, and that we have to differentiate between different, let's say, areas? For example, there's Islam in party politics. It's still quite weak. I mean, most parties in Indonesia are, I would say, mostly secular, like PDIP or Golkar, or even Prabowo's party. I mean, religion plays a role, but overall, these parties seem to be more secular. But at the social level, I mean, in private life, for example, Islam seems to me now much more important than 20, 30, or 40 years ago. And I'm, yeah, sometimes a bit confused. Is Indonesia now more Islamic, or is it the same like 20, 30 years ago? What do you think?
Well, yeah, I think your perception is also valid, because like when we talk about the expression of society, and then we talk about how important religion in their daily life, for example. So we also talk about how Islam is being mobilized, and we must like acknowledge that there is the important role of religious authority, and this will lead us to understand to actually this religious authority are being accommodated by the ruling power. And of course, yeah, you were right that we have to like some kind of differentiate between groups. Like, for example, in my book, I separate this conservative and then some moderate groups, and then Islamic-based party. Like in 2024, for example, like Indonesia's two largest Islamic groups, the moderate ones, Nahdlatul Ulama or NU and Muhammadiyah, they accepted the Joko Widodo government to manage coal mining concessions. So we can see like these Islamic groups can partly be seen as being co-opted. But these two organizations are historically moderate and they're rarely opposed to government. And when we talk about the political Islam within the electoral context, well, I think the trends tends to be stagnated at around 8 to 10%, like in the last national election in 2024. For example, the highest vote share among Islamic-based party was held by the National Awakening Party, the PKB, with only around 10%, and the Prosperous Justice Party, the PKS, with only 8%. So it's far from the majority. Yeah.
Okay, the blasphemy law is a good example of what is called in the literature lawfare, and you have worked a lot on lawfare. That means using laws in order to maybe suppress civil society activists or opposition groups. Would you say that the blasphemy law is now part of this lawfare in Indonesia?
Yeah, I agree with you because, like, when we talk about blasphemy lawfare, we talk about again religious authority and we talk about religious mobilizations. And this mobilization is always the main factor that define the path of blasphemy accusation becoming convictions. And mobilizations mean large-scale mass pressures. So here we can see how political elites considered blasphemy narratives and found them handy. So I would say this is how blasphemy became a lawfare. So the main part is the pressures. And I think it's not only using the blasphemy laws, but also other uh, regulations that related to free speech and so on. Yeah.
Yeah. So within our project, we had a certain focus on the ITE law, because
Yeah.
we are mostly interested in freedom of expression in social media, for example. And then there's a new criminal code that started this year in Indonesia, a major reform project. How would you assess the ITE law in terms of freedom of expression? Is it problematic in your view? And what about the new criminal code? I mean, it is still, as I understand, implemented, and they still need a lot of regulations to implement the criminal code. Do you think that the criminal code restricts certain basic rights? Or would you say that to an extent the new criminal code is maybe even a kind of progress in terms of democracy and human rights? Because as some proponents of this code would say, it is a form to get rid of colonial laws, because it is the first real Indonesian criminal code. How do you see it as a lawyer, as a law expert?
Yeah, I think the main part of the pressures, the lawfare, well, also in this regulation, the law, and some may argue that the criminal law has been revised with the new one, with the better one, as an effort to decolonizing and so on. But in fact, there are still numerous provisions that can be easily deployed by those in power. Like we see, for example, criminal offenses of insulting the president, spreading banned ideology that is considered against the state ideology Pancasila, and this will have a chance for red tagging, like for leftist activists. And recently is the accusation of treason. So there are still more issues in this code. Well, legal scholars may argue that this is not as bad as it looks, but again, saying the law as if it were just text doesn't really sound, And focusing all efforts on legal strategy might also risk to neglect the establishment of strong progressive political movement that Indonesia needs to strengthen the democracy. I think, yeah.
Yeah, I would be interested in how laws are actually made in Indonesia. Let's say the criminal code. Was it an inclusive project? Was it a democratic project that civil society organizations were asked about what should be in this criminal code? Or was it more a top-down process? What do you think?
Yeah, I think if we say that the process is quite following how uh, the good lawmaking procedure, I think it could be accepted. But there are always like dynamics in the House of Representatives, for example, that will be more powerful than just drafting these ideal provisions and then like adjusting with how make this provision as ideal and so on. Because like in Indonesia, it is difficult like to say that uh, we can just rely on the legal system. Like um, from my perspective, I think it's unlikely that the legal system is autonomous. So when we talk about the recent situation of Indonesian law, I think we can see that how obvious that legal system is never neutral.
Yeah, that is actually my next question. I mean, you said that the legal system and the courts are not really independent or autonomous. And I have read one or two articles of yours. I think you think that the legal system has evolved in a very specific form in Indonesia, different from law systems in Europe, for example. In Europe, you could maybe say that courts are all in all quite independent and that there are different powers that are excluded from each other and have their autonomy. But in Indonesia, it's different. You say that those in power have have undermined this autonomy that should have been there in Indonesia.
Yeah, that's a good question actually, because like actually from my perspective, I think like any legal system, so not only Indonesia, like there is unlikely that any legal system is neutral or autonomous. The question is what power that will back up this legal system, right? So when we, for example, when we talk about Indonesia case and we raise the question about the court independent, for example, to those in law enforcement or with the judges, for example, they would definitely say that they are independent, and this is like guaranteed by law. The regulations, the guarantee for judicial independence is there. But I think it is fair to say that the court leadership, for example, is not isolated from power contest. And like, for example, the justices of the Supreme Court, they still need approval from the House of Representatives. And other issues we see is that the number of corruption cases in the judicial institutions is quite high. I think last year the NGO Indonesian Corruption Watch, it's an anti-corruption watchdog. They issued a report documenting that 29 judges were charged as corruption suspects from 2011 to 2024. So since the court should be the place where citizens seek justice, there should be zero cases of corruption, right? And we know that the court has been the priority in legal reform program since post-reform. But even the court system still faces challenges. They face welfare issues, they face like judges' workloads, and then the hierarchical structure of the career advancement. So in this context, I think it will be difficult to say that the courts are independent, the law enforcement are independent. So this is like something that we can observe with just reports, for example.
So would you say that your approach is a kind of political economy approach? You are more interested in something like class interests of judges or of people who intervene in court processes? Is it like that? Would you maybe talk about the oligarchy in Indonesia, the bourgeoisie that somehow has a major impact on court proceedings? Is it an approach like that?
Yeah, actually, I talk a lot like in my books.
Mm.
Like I use an interdisciplinary approach because it is hard to understand how the law operates when I just use my legal, mindset. Like most of legal scholars, the majority here in Indonesia. So yeah, I think that's why in my book I talk about this certain form of capitalism that impacted the legal system, for example. And I also see this elite contest that impacted of how the law operates. So yeah, and I also analyze court decisions actually, and I can, yeah. So it's like beside interviews, I also analyze the court decision and see how the pattern of certain cases can prove my hypothesis.
But if one uses a political economy approach in a very strong sense, it seems that laws and courts are always used by those in power. But my notion is that laws are sometimes supporting minorities, for example, even in Indonesia. I mean, there are many laws that are to an extent even problematic to the oligarchic elite. Would you say that this is true?
Yeah, maybe there are some like, how do I call it? Like maybe a success story for the citizen lawsuit, but we should also see how this how the government, for example, implemented these decisions. And well, yeah, I think it should be the bare minimum. But when we see what happened after the August 2025 protest, for example, we can see that law have been very handy for the ruling elites. I mean, to the state to charge like I think it's more than 5,000 arrests made by the police, and charges were against almost 1,000 people just within perhaps like 2 or 3 months. And then the human rights defender Andre Yunus got an acid attack by the army. So the pressures are massive. Like this is actually like the main part of the lawfare, if I can say. So when we talk this, like, oh, maybe law can be a chance to like contesting this, the idea of legality, or contesting how possible the citizen challenging this arena, for example. But the fact, the evidence show, you know, it doesn't work like that. Ironically, yeah.
But there are hundreds or even thousands of non-governmental organizations in Indonesia, many civil society organizations, reformist, pro-democratic, liberal civil society organizations, also many who work on improving laws, on countering lawfare. Would you say that the fight, the struggle by these CSOs makes sense, or do they have a chance to really counter the creeping process of maybe even autocratization in Indonesia?
We see like some law have ways of silencing critics, you know, countering the narrative and confusing social media users. And this usually is something that should be usually addressed by pro-democratic groups, by the campaign, and then policy advocacy, you know. But something that often be missed in this strategy is like empower their real social base, if any.
Yeah, okay. Thanks so much, Rafiqa. That was very interesting. I hope you visit us in Hamburg at GIGA, maybe this year or next year, and then we can talk again about these topics. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Andreas. It's a pleasure to talk with you about this and my research, and hope this could bring insights for the audience of this podcast. And yeah, congratulations to you and your team on this project.